The U.S. strategic nuclear doctrine has been in a near-constant evolution since the advent of the nuclear weapons age in 1945. The current U.S. doctrine is based not on mutual assured destruction, but on the concept of a limited nuclear war that started changing U.S. and Soviet nuclear strategy in the 1960s. Debates about a limited nuclear war objective or strict deterrence continue today, as they did starting in the 1960s. The original doctrine of mutual assured destruction focused on the cities of the opponents, which housed their populations and key economic assets. Later, we classified these cities and economic targets as counter-value assets. The counter-value targets became the primary source of deterrence, as a country could not survive without its population and industry, which are essential to modern society. Hold these under threat, and a country would not dare escalate a war to the point that nuclear weapons would be used because ultimate destruction was guaranteed. The strategic targeting doctrine evolved to support more focused objectives, introducing a new category known as counterforce. This was a targeting idea that focused on the strategic nuclear weapons of the other country. In 1980, President Carter introduced a new categorization known as countervailing, based on political objectives, key industries, communication, and command and control centers. The focus will be on the original ideas of countervalue and counterforce, with the knowledge that countervailing is a part of counterforce targeting in more recent versions of the nuclear targeting doctrines. U.S. nuclear doctrine was formulated with two primary objectives. Once the Soviet Union achieved nuclear parity with the U.S. in the second half of the 1960s. The U.S. doctrine was to deter nuclear attacks on the U.S. and its allies, the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and to limit the extent of the damage if nuclear deterrence fails. The Brookings Institution identifies how the two objectives are achieved. 1. The objective of deterrence is achieved by maintaining a strategic nuclear force of sufficient size and capability to threaten valued Soviet assets. 2. If deterrence fails or appears to have failed, the objective was to limit damage to the U.S. in three ways. A. Limiting the scope of the initial nuclear attack. B. Avoid attacks on Soviet cities while holding a reserve force of strategic nuclear weapons to destroy the city-esque. Reduce the Soviet ability to launch nuclear attacks by destroying their nuclear forces, command and control assets, and political and military leadership. The U.S. strategy was to de-incentivize the Soviets from attacking U.S. cities by threatening their cities, while at the same time targeting and destroying Soviet strategic nuclear assets. And the Soviets appeared to have a similar doctrine with their large ICBM force that could be used for large-scale counterforce attacks on the U.S. The U.S. nuclear umbrella also created a complication for the U.S. was obligated to use nuclear weapons in protection of its allies. The U.S. and its allies could see their conventional forces overrun by larger Chinese and Soviet forces, and could be put in a scenario that it would have to use tactical or theater nuclear weapons, possibly as a first use, and would try to do so without inviting attacks on U.S. cities by the Soviet Union or Chinese. This U.S. desire to avoid the destruction of its cities while protecting its allies did create questions among its allies on whether the U.S. would be willing to risk its cities in defense of its allies. This was most famously argued by French President Charles de Gaulle to U.S. President John F. Kennedy in 1961, and it was one that Kennedy refused to answer. The adoption of a counterforce doctrine in the Cold War meant keeping the nuclear forces that were dedicated to counterforce attacks on a high state of readiness, and a doctrine to be able to launch them in a relatively short period of time. This also meant that a system to detect launches, the earlier the better, from the Soviet Union needed to be created and maintained. This use of new technologies with few ways to fully test them needed to be reliable, as the hair-trigger status of counterforce nuclear weapons increased the risk of an accidental nuclear exchange. A false reading of a nuclear launch could result in an accidental nuclear war, and a delay in confirming the authenticity of a detection could lead to the destruction of the nuclear force, rendering the U.S. defenseless in a potential follow-on attack. The incentive was to risk an accidental launch rather than the destruction of counterforce nuclear forces. The doctrine of launch on warning, also known as move them or lose them, creates an orientation that favors launching over the risk of waiting. Another problem is that the counterforce doctrine adds more targets, such as tactical and strategic nuclear forces, command and control centers, weapons storage facilities, key industries like defense and refineries, political targets, and so on. The list can go on, especially if the limited nuclear war scenario is a protracted one that uses city avoidance. The point is that types of targets can become unlimited, to the point that the number of targets could exceed the weapons available, as was experienced during the arms race of the Cold War. The number of weapons could be viewed as destabilizing in itself, but it also disincentivizes military and political leaders to reduce their arsenals, as there will always be a need for counterforce targets and predispose countries like the US and the Soviet Union, now Russia, to hold on to strategic nuclear arsenals that are much larger than what is needed for simple deterrence. The next part of this article will talk about more factors of counterforce doctrine target scenarios that pushed for not only more, but also different kinds of nuclear weapons. It will end with a discussion of how eliminating counter-value as a strategic nuclear target option could cause the major nuclear powers to reduce their current nuclear forces.